Thank you very much, Phil. I'm very honored and excited to be telling you about this new opportunity that we have been working on. But before I do that, I wanted to give you a little bit of a sense of what the mitochondrial disease community has been doing over the years. These discussions about how complex primary mitochondrial disorders are and how challenging it is to develop and conduct clinical trials for primary mitochondrial disease has been an ongoing issue that has been rehashed within the community over the years, and for which some solutions have already been developed. So in order to understand what we need for the future, we need to understand what we have available now. We have several stakeholders within the community that have been striving over the years to improve the diagnosis, the management, the clinical care of our patient with primary mitochondrial disease, and we all ultimately had in mind that hope and that promise of a cure for the future. Of course, all we do, and at the center of all of this, are our patients and their families. We have patients that are all over the United States that are suffering with this disease, and they are our inspiration of why we do what we do every day. Those patients over the years have been cared for by several specialists, some knowledgeable about mitochondrial disease and some are not. And so it became clear a few years ago that these patients needed to have a home, a clinical home with clinicians within multidisciplinary clinics that knew and had expertise about primary mitochondrial disease. And so in 2018, the Mitochondrial Care Network was developed, certifying clinicians and clinical site as mitochondrial medicine centers where a patient could go and can receive a multidisciplinary coordinated care for their primary mitochondrial disorders. So we're happy to have about 21 of these sites across the US. And the hope is that these patients would come in and would obtain the optimized clinical management and care that they deserve, but also a way for us clinicians to really keep track of where these patients are, how many we have, to very quickly mobilize them in case a clinical trial becomes available, and also to keep them aware of what the opportunities are out there, whether it's clinical or translational research. The community also has tremendous advocacy. We have several advocacy groups that are listed here. Of course, the United Mitochondrial Disease Foundation have been leading the way for many years now and has been instrumental in funding a lot of basic and clinical research over the years that has really pushed the path forward and pushed the research forward for our primary mitochondrial disease patient. More recently, the UMDF has been involved in the finding a cure for Lee syndrome and bringing together international experts to try to come up with solution as to how to design clinical trials and optimize clinical trials for Lee syndrome. The United Mitochondrial Disease Foundation also has a patient registry that captures data from patients that is put themselves into the registry. And so these advocacy groups have been really instrumental in the mitochondrial community. We also have professional societies that have been efforts that have been led by physicians and scientists interested and involved in mitochondrial medicine. The Mitochondrial Medicine Society is one of them. This was developed about 20 years ago and puts forth clinical guidelines for primary mitochondrial disease diagnostics and management. And the idea is we are really trying to harmonize and unify the care that our patients receive across the United States. The Mitochondrial Research and Medicine Society has done the same for the basic science, the biology of mitochondrial medicine, and has put mitochondria on the map internationally over the years. We also have research consortia that are federally funded. The North American Mitochondrial Disease Consortium, led by Dr. Michio Hirano, has been instrumental over the last 9 years to put together a physician-curated registry and biorepository for patients with primary mitochondrial disease or patients who are suspected of having a primary mitochondrial disease. The consortium has about 19 sites of researchers and clinicians that are working together to try to better understand the disease and come up with outcome measures and design a clinical trial for patients with PMD. MSeq-DR, led by Dr. Marnie Falk, CHOP has also tried to do the same from the molecular perspective and the genomic perspective, developing this huge resource where we can, in one place, find all the information available about a certain gene or a certain mutation that can lead to mitochondrial disease. You will hear a lot more about the MCN, MSeq-DR, and NEMDEC later today, with specific updates on their efforts. We also have a lot of researchers that are involved in the US with mitochondrial medicine and mitochondria in general. We have basic translational and clinical researchers. We have collaboration nationally and internationally. We also have our industry partners, and we have more and more of them over the years. Pharmaceutical companies that are interested in engaging with the community to try to see whether their products could be amenable to a trial in primary mitochondrial diseases. Companies that already have a product that they think is very valuable and are trying to pursue clinical trials, companies that already do clinical trial, and also diagnostic laboratories that provide genetic testing and other biochemical testing for the diagnosis of mitochondrial disorders. And then we have legislators, federal government, with whom we interact very routinely in terms of introducing new legislation for diagnostic, therapeutic, or rare diseases in general, and improving funding for mitochondrial disease research, as well as accelerating pathways of drug approval, like you've heard this morning from the workshop done at the FDA. So all of these entities and stakeholders have been working together over the years and have done really a good job at communicating and collaborating. The problem is, however, that these collaborations and interactions have so far been very siloed. You have the clinicians collaborating with the advocacy group, the patient, the professional society, industry, research, and you have arrows going all over the place with every entity trying to collaborate and not duplicate efforts with other entities. This makes it a huge challenge because unless you are part of all of these entities at once, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing, and that creates a lot of delays and a lot of duplicate efforts in trying to reach that goal of finding a cure for our mitochondrial disease patient. So the solution that we want to come up with is, how do we unify these stakeholders and all of these efforts into a unified approach or a one silo that takes into consideration all the needs of all of these stakeholders and try to come up with a unified solution to all the problems that we talked about today. And we think that one of those solutions is to create an entity called the Translational Research Advancing Therapy for Mitochondrial Disease. This is a Treat Mito Consortium that was developed to specifically address the clinical trial needs for our community. In order to develop this entity, we have looked at colleagues and other rare disorders and non-rare disorders that have gone through this. This is not something unique to primary mitochondrial disease or a new dilemma that we are facing alone. A lot of other disorders, common and rare, have gone through the same process of trying to unify, organize, and accelerate the therapeutic efforts to try to come up with a treatment for their own disorders. So instead of reinventing the wheel, we wanted to learn from all of those efforts and see the good and the bad, what has worked, what hasn't worked. And so over the past few years, I have been really surveying the landscape to see what has been done before. And if for doing so, I reached out to industry partners, partners that we had already engaged with to do clinical trials, partners that were interested in conducting clinical trials in mitochondrial disease, patient advocacy groups that have been at the forefront and listening to the patients and what the patient needs are, FDA consultants and FDA regulators, principal investigators that are doing basic science, translational science, and clinical research, and other clinical trial consortia, whether they were for disorders like cancer, which has led this effort many, many years ago and has been very successful in streamlining the treatment for cancer and clinical trial for cancer, or whether it's for other rare diseases such as amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. I have had conversation with several of these people to see how they develop their clinical trial consortia and what has worked and hasn't worked for them. So after distilling all the information from all of these discussions, in partnership with the UMDF and other clinicians such as Dr. Hirano, Dr. Cohn, Dr. Haas, we have met repeatedly to try to flesh out what Treat Mito would look like and what its mission would be. And this is what we would like preliminarily to present to you today, which is very exciting for us, is that we think that Treat Mito is a much needed new entity that is going to bring all the mitochondrial disease community stakeholders together. And the mission as we see it, and this will develop over time, is to really develop, organize, and oversee the unified pipeline for drug development in mitochondrial disorders. We would like to really be able to evaluate and support early drug development and translational efforts for primary mitochondrial diseases and mitochondrial diseases in general. We would like to develop patient-centered outcome measures for therapeutic studies in children and adults with mitochondrial disease, and facilitate and eventually conduct multi-site clinical trials to streamline drug development. We also want this ultimate effort to try to improve medical care and health outcomes for our patients with mitochondrial disease. So how are we going to achieve that? Well, we need to self-organize much more and much better than what we are doing currently. We need, as you have heard throughout the day today, well-defined outcome measures. These are extremely important for us to be able to conduct successful clinical trials. How do we get to outcome measures that are well-validated and well-established for primary mitochondrial disease? Well, we need a lot of data. Data. We need patient, we need to validate these outcomes, and we need to come up with outcomes that are meaningful to our patients. How do we do that? We need academic sites with specialists in the disease to work together. We already started doing that by developing these mitochondrial care network and by developing the North American Mitochondrial Disease Consortium. Now we have to have them interface and talk to each other from the clinical and the research perspective. We need available and willing patients that are educated about clinical trial research so that they get engaged in being part of these clinical trials. It's not enough to develop trial and have them available. We need to enroll these trials. And how do we do that? We need to have engaged patients that see the value into enrolling in these clinical trials. And the only way we can achieve that is really to educate our patients. We need a unified collection of biological specimen to do more research, to be able to come up with those biomarkers and outcomes and all of that, something that we have started doing with NAMDEG, MSIG-DR, and the MCN and the UMDF registry as well. So what's going on right now is that we are doing bits and pieces of all of this, but these efforts have been really scattered. So rather than attacking all of these issues bit by bit or disease by disease or center by center, we need really to work together at attacking this disease, not by a single company, not by a single academic investigator or center, but really by unifying all of these players into a platform with entities that create a network where we can share all of this data, interface, and communicate, and where that left hand really knows what the right hand is doing. So our short-term goals include the development of an expert governance board that will oversee the approaches that we are going to take. This is kind of similar to the scientific advisory board that will initially lay down the developments out there and try to engage with industry, engage with the regulatory entities, and try to come up with a priority list of things that we need to do. Second, we need to formally evaluate and analyze the mitochondrial disease landscape in the US. We need to better understand our patients and their families and caregivers' perspective about clinical trials in general, what is meaningful to them in terms of outcome measures that they would be that they would agree upon and that would seem appropriate to them. We need to survey what the needs of our pharmaceutical and industry partners are, because what works for them as private companies and what their endpoints are really different from ours in academia and those of advocacy groups. So we need to work together to try to better understand what our needs are. And we also need to have an inventory of available scientific and clinical resources within the community, so that if we need to develop that outcome measure or come up with that biomarker, we need to know who the players are that we can tap into to help expedite this process. The long term of Treat Mito is also to develop a centralized collaborative infrastructure with a unified information platform that would allow the creation of a data-driven path forward in drug development for primary mitochondrial disease and mitochondrial diseases in general. This is going to be helpful to inform design support and eventually manage innovative observational and interventional trials for mitochondrial disease. Some of this is already ongoing, but as I said, it's ongoing into silos and using different platforms that don't always interact or communicate with each other. So what the goal here is really to try to interface with each other in a much more efficient way, to try to share that information and try to find the gaps very quickly and fill them more appropriately, as opposed to restarting every effort and duplicating these efforts. What our vision really is for this Treat Mito consortium to really help support the community in a much more comprehensive way, and to not restart anything fresh or recreate the wheels, as we say, but really try to leverage the community resources that are available now, build upon them, improve the interface between these silos to try to really expedite this process, and to really help our industry partners find a home where, instead of going from one investigator or one academic center at a time to try to gather information and develop these advisory board meetings, to have a one-stop shop where they can come in and tell us what their needs are, and we can help them engage the whole community from beginning to end to try to help them designing their clinical trial, help them select the patient population needed to enhance the possibilities of reaching their endpoints, try to help them come up with the best outcome measure available, and if that's not available, trying to work together to develop those outcome measure while tapping into the resources within the community that we already have. Ultimately, we would like to have access to all the resources from these clinical trial once they are done, whether the drug gets FDA approval or the drug fails. We want all that information that we gather from those trials to be housed in this consortium so that we can learn from it and we can use it to further our understanding of the disease and how clinical trials are conducted. Ultimately, what this is going to achieve is that we will be refining the disease phenotype, improving our natural histories intake, improving our biomarker development and discovery. We will strive to tailor our outcome measures to the clinical trial at hand and the product at hand, individualized clinical trial designs for our patient population, the drug, the target's effect, and have more streamlined regulatory discussions to help improve the timelines for these clinical trials. We're hoping that all of that is going to accelerate FDA approval and help our patient and our community achieve that cure much faster. And with that, I will stop, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.